As my heir, William now assumes the Scottish titles which have meant so much to me. He succeeds me as Duke of Cornwall.
Prince Edward did not inherit a palace. He did not inherit the land beneath it, and the title King Charles finally gave him will die with him. Yet buried inside a government report is one word that changes the entire story: assignable. That word may explain why an arrangement made decades ago could survive Edward, survive Charles, and possibly outlast William's plans for a smaller monarchy. This was not the inheritance the public expected. It was something quieter, longer, and protected by a force even the crown must respect: the law. Here is the contradiction at the center of this story. Prince Edward now holds one of the oldest ducal titles in the British peerage, and that title dies with him. No son inherits it, no grandchild waits in line for it. When Edward, Duke of Edinburgh, is gone, the title snaps back to the crown, exactly as it did the day his father died in 2021. But 3 miles from Windsor Castle, a different clock is running. This investigation separates 3 things the headlines keep blurring into one: a royal title, ownership of a royal property, and a leasehold contract. They are not the same instrument, and they do not expire on the same terms. Let's be precise about what has and has not happened. No verified statement from Prince Edward's lawyers exists confirming a secret inheritance. No public record shows King Charles denying his brother anything in a legal sense. What we do have is stranger and better documented: an official title announcement, a National Audit Office investigation published in June 2026, and the governing law that sits underneath both. 4 documents sit on the table in front of us: a promise, publicly signaled in 1999, that a title would one day pass to Edward; a gap of nearly 2 years after his father's death, when the title sat unclaimed; a restriction written into the 2023 letters patent that quietly changed what inheriting a dukedom actually means; and a Surrey property lease that this year's government audit flagged with a single loaded word: assignable. We are not chasing a scandal here. We are chasing a paper trail, and paper trails in this family rarely lead where the headlines promise. Start with the fortune, and you usually end up somewhere far less glamorous: in the fine print of institutional control, where the real decisions about who gets what, and for how long, are actually made. Treat this the way a cold case detective treats an old file. Not with outrage, with sequence. Every date matters. Every document either confirms the last one or quietly contradicts it. And the contradictions are where this story actually lives. The public believes it is watching a fight over money. It is actually watching a fight over duration, over which arrangements survive a single lifetime and which ones are built to outlast it. The first clue in this case was not buried in a 2026 government report. It was placed in plain public view 27 years ago, in a church on a June afternoon, when a prince married a public relations executive, and the palace made a promise it would take almost a quarter of a century to keep. Rewind to June 1999. Prince Edward marries Sophie Rhys-Jones at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. He does not become a royal duke that day, and royal watchers notice immediately, because every other son of the monarch traditionally receives a dukedom on his wedding day. Buckingham Palace offers an explanation, and it is a specific one. According to reporting from that period, the Queen, Prince Philip, and the then Prince Charles had agreed that Edward would receive the Dukedom of Edinburgh in due course, once his father no longer held it. Edward, for the moment, becomes Earl of Wessex instead. This detail matters more than it first appears. The palace was not simply managing a wedding announcement. It was pre-committing, in public, to a succession plan for a title that would not become available for another 22 years. Sophie at the time worked in public relations, running her own firm. Some early coverage speculated that the couple's decision to keep working, rather than step immediately into full-time royal duties, shaped how the palace framed their titles. Nothing about that decision was hidden. It was reported at the time as a deliberate choice. Consider what that promise was actually built on. The Duke of Edinburgh's award, Prince Philip's youth development programme, had by then already changed the lives of millions of young people across dozens of countries. Edward had spent years quietly involved in that legacy, long before anyone expected him to inherit the man's name as well as his work. No private conversation is being reconstructed here. No one is claiming to know what was said inside Buckingham Palace in 1999. What can be documented is the public commitment itself, and the fact that it created an expectation Edward could not fulfill on his own. The promise depended entirely on outliving his father, and on whichever monarch held the crown when that day came. Sophie, in the years that followed, builds a reputation as one of the steadiest working members of the family, largely outside the tabloid storylines that follow other branches of the household. Royal commentators have often pointed to the Wessex, later Edinburgh, household as the family's quietest and most conventionally functional unit. That stability becomes relevant later. For now, remember only this. A royal promise sounds personal when it is made. Its fulfillment depends entirely on whoever is holding power when the bill finally comes due. Then, within 18 months of each other, 2 deaths change everything, and the promise stops being a family understanding. It becomes a decision that only one man, King Charles III, has the power to make. Prince Philip dies in April 2021 at Windsor Castle at the age of 99. The Dukedom of Edinburgh, held by him since his 1947 wedding, technically merges back into the crown. Queen Elizabeth II dies in September 2022. Charles becomes king immediately, under the constitutional principle that the throne never sits empty. Edward is now, technically, entitled to raise the 23-year-old promise. He does not receive the title immediately. Months pass. Royal correspondents begin asking, in print, whether Charles intends to honor the arrangement his mother and father set in motion in 1999. The delay is real, it is publicly reported, and it is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. Here is where labeled speculation belongs, and only here. Some royal commentators have suggested the pause reflected Charles's broader project of a smaller, leaner monarchy, one with fewer working titles circulating among extended family. Others have argued the title required careful legal handling before any announcement, given its long and specific royal history. A third camp has proposed that Charles was always going to honor his parents' wishes and simply wanted his brother's 59th birthday, not an arbitrary date, to be the moment he did it. None of these 3 interpretations is confirmed. All 3 are plausible. That is what labeled speculation looks like, and none of it should be mistaken for a documented fact. Notice what none of the 3 theories claim. None of them describe a fight. None of them describe Charles refusing his brother anything. The word denied, which shows up in so many headline versions of this story, does not appear anywhere in the documented record of this period. What appears instead is a wait, a public one, that outside observers were free to interpret however they chose. What is documented is the date. On March 10th, 2023, on the occasion of Edward's 59th birthday, Buckingham Palace announces that Charles has conferred the Dukedom of Edinburgh upon his younger brother. The letters patent follow on April 3rd. Consider the emotional weight of that timing. Edward receives his father's title only after losing both parents within 18 months of each other. The 2 people most associated with the original 1999 promise are no longer alive to see it kept. He inherits a name built by 2 people who are no longer in the room. For a moment, the story appears to resolve itself cleanly. A promise made, a promise honored, 24 years later, almost to the season. Then come 5 words in the official announcement that quietly reopen the entire case, held only during his lifetime. Read the actual language of the March 2023 announcement, not the headline summary of it. Charles confers the Dukedom of Edinburgh upon Prince Edward, but this 4th creation of the title is explicitly a life peerage. That means James, Earl of Wessex, Edward's son, does not stand to inherit the dukedom his father now holds. When Edward dies, the title does not pass down, it reverts to the crown, the same fate that met it after Prince Philip's death. This is the pivot point of the entire investigation, and it deserves to be stated plainly rather than dramatically. Edward was honoured personally. His family line was not granted permanent possession of the title. Run the consequences forward. Edward received what had been publicly promised in 1999. James did not receive the dynasty that a casual reading of the news might have implied came with it. Charles fulfilled his parents' wishes while simultaneously protecting his own vision of a streamlined monarchy for the next generation. And William, as the future king, inherits a royal family with one fewer permanent ducal branch to manage than his grandfather's generation had. No one in this story needs to be cast as a villain here, and the evidence does not support casting anyone as one.
When you have members of the Commonwealth Games associations from around the Commonwealth, and they all come in and peer through all the venues and all the rest of it, I mean, you're going to draw up inevitable issues. We're still a year away, so yes, there are issues to be dealt with, but
Two readings sit side by side, equally defensible. The compassionate reading. Charles preserved his father's legacy by placing it, even temporarily, in the hands of the son who had spent the most time carrying that legacy forward. The institutional reading. Charles kept the promise in the narrowest form, compatible with a monarchy built around fewer working titles, not more. Both readings can be true at once. Institutions rarely choose between sentiment and strategy. More often, they find the single option that satisfies both and call it a compromise. That is very likely what happened here, whichever motive sat closer to the surface on the day the decision was finalized. Notice, too, what the announcement never claimed. It never promised James a future title, and no headline from that week reported that it did. Either way, the title itself carries no hidden estate, no automatic fortune, and no secret palace. Dukedoms in the modern peerage do not come bundled with land the way they once did centuries ago. Whatever residence Edward and Sophie occupy is governed by an entirely separate legal instrument, negotiated years before Charles ever wore the crown. That instrument is not in Edinburgh. It is in Surrey, at a Grade 2 listed mansion called Bagshot Park, and its terms turn out to be far more durable than anything written into the 2023 letters patent. The title was the ceremony. The lease, as the next file shows, was the substance. Bagshot Park is a 120-room Victorian mansion on 51 acres inside Windsor Great Park, built in 1879 for one of Queen Victoria's sons. Edward and Sophie have lived there since 1998. Follow the paper. In March 1998, the Crown Estate leases the mansion to the then Earl of Wessex for 50 years, at an initial rent of £5,000 annually, rising to £90,000 a year once renovation work was complete. Edward personally contributes roughly £1.4 million toward those renovations, on top of what the Crown Estate itself paid. Then, in 2007, the arrangement changes shape entirely. Edward's company, Eclipse Nominees Limited, signs a new agreement, extending the lease to 150 years, running until 2157, in exchange for a £5 million upfront premium. At today's exchange rate, that is roughly $6.5 million American dollars, though the figure has floated with currency swings over the years. After that payment, the rent drops to a peppercorn, a token sum, legally binding, practically nothing. For years, the couple was also permitted to sublet a converted stable block on the estate, generating private rental income, an arrangement that continued for roughly 2 decades before ending in 2020. Some reporting has since suggested the Edinburghs also generated undisclosed income by leasing part of the grounds to the Royal Collection Trust. The exact figures involved were not made public. Bagshot Park does not stand alone in this year's audit. The same National Audit Office investigation examined Andrew Mountbatten Windsor's lease on Royal Lodge, a separate Windsor Great Park property, and found he paid no ongoing rent at all for roughly 2 decades, while also earning private income from subletting cottages on that estate. The contrast is instructive. Edward's arrangement, whatever its long-term generosity, was at least market-tested at the point of signing. Andrew's was not. This script is about Edward's case specifically, but the wider report makes clear that generous leases were not unique to one branch of the family. Now bring in the newest document, the National Audit Office's June 2026 investigation into royal residential arrangements names Eclipse Nominees Limited as the formal leaseholder of Bagshot Park, with Edward and Sophie as the occupants. And the report states something specific about both Bagshot Park and one other royal lease, that they can be transferred to an approved person or organisation with the Crown Estate's permission. Say that plainly. Assignable, not automatically inherited, not guaranteed to any particular family member, but structurally capable of continuing under new hands long after the current occupants are gone, provided the Crown Estate signs off. Bagshot Park itself is not Edward's property in any ownership sense. The freehold sits with the Crown Estate as it always has. But the contract governing who lives there and for how long was built with a horizon measured in centuries, not in one man's lifetime. Charles could make a dukedom expire on schedule. The lease, signed 16 years before Charles became king, was never built to expire on anyone's schedule at all.
Now, for the Princess of Wales, of course.
Well, it's a completely different case. Whether you draw lessons or not, it's a completely different case. It's a different set of circumstances altogether. I mean, what happened back in the 30s were a set of circumstances which have never been repeated since, and God forbid that they ever should.
What about his German sympathies? Do you think that if...
This is where the investigation turns from royal ceremony into public law, and it is worth slowing down here, because this is also where the clickbait version of this story falls apart completely. The Crown Estate is not King Charles's personal property to hand out among relatives as he sees fit. It is a statutory public body governed by the Crown Estate Act of 1961. Under that law, the Crown Estate Commissioners have a legal duty to maintain and enhance the value of the estate and the income it produces, while observing what the statute calls good management. That duty runs to the public and to Parliament, not to the royal family as private beneficiaries. Break down what that actually means in practice. The king is not the personal owner of Bagshot Park in any ordinary sense. The Crown Estate manages it as an independent commercial business. A lease is a binding legal agreement between a landlord, the Crown Estate, and a tenant, in this case a company controlled by Edward. Assigning that lease to someone else still requires following its terms and securing the Crown Estate's formal permission, regardless of what any family member privately wants. Follow the logic to its conclusion. Edward cannot simply hand the freehold to his son, because Edward does not own the freehold to give. And Charles, despite being monarch, cannot casually tear up a properly constituted commercial lease just because he holds the crown. The contract answers to statute and to the Crown Estate Commissioners, not to royal preference. This is the moment to retire the headline entirely. No lawyer confirmed anything, because no confirmation was necessary. Any competent reading of these public documents arrives at the same conclusion a trained solicitor would reach. Edward's title and Edward's residence are governed by two completely different legal mechanisms, operating on two completely different timelines, and neither one required a courtroom, a legal letter, or a dramatic confrontation to exist. No fictional solicitor needs to be invoked here. No invented meeting needs to be staged. The documents themselves, sitting in the National Archives and in this year's National Audit Office report, are the only witnesses this case actually requires. Scale matters here too. The Crown Estate's total property portfolio was valued at roughly £14.5 billion in its most recent annual report, spanning central London real estate, rural farmland, and most of the seabed around the United Kingdom. Bagshot Park is one lease among thousands the commissioners administer, governed by the same statutory framework as all the others, not by a private ledger the king keeps for family favours. That framework exists because Parliament decided, over 60 years ago, that royal property should not run on personal discretion alone. Charles held real authority over one thing: the honour. He held considerably less authority over the other: the contract. Prince William enters this story not through rumour, but through documented institutional relevance. Because whatever the Crown Estate decides about long-standing leases eventually becomes his problem to manage. As heir to the throne, William inherits a modernising project his father began. Fewer working royals, tighter public accountability, closer scrutiny of who receives what and why. Any long-term lease signed decades before his reign will still be sitting on the books when he becomes king, regardless of his own preferences. The same June 2026 National Audit Office report that names the Bagshot Park arrangement also documents William and Catherine's own residential terms, and the contrast is instructive. The Prince and Princess of Wales hold a 20-year lease on Forest Lodge, their Windsor home, agreed in 2025. That is a fraction of Bagshot Park's 150-year term. Their arrangement reportedly involves regular rent payments, rather than a single upfront premium, followed by a peppercorn. And the couple is understood to be funding portions of the property's internal refurbishment themselves, rather than splitting the cost with the Crown Estate, the way Edward did in the late 1990s. None of this proves William is angry, threatened, or privately stunned by his uncle's arrangement. No documented evidence supports any of those specific emotional claims, and this script will not manufacture them. What the comparison does demonstrate is structural. An older, more generous lease, signed in a different era of royal finance, can sit awkwardly beside a newer, tighter one, without anyone needing to have a confrontation about it at all. Forest Lodge itself has been widely reported as William and Catherine's long-term family home. An 8-bedroom house the couple moved into in 2025 after an extensive renovation. Royal commentators have described the move as part of a broader effort by the Prince and Princess of Wales to present a more modest, more relatable model of royal life than earlier generations projected. Whether that framing is accurate or aspirational is itself a matter of ongoing public debate rather than settled fact. A future king inheriting this landscape faces 3 competing pressures simultaneously. Honouring lawful agreements made by previous reigns, since the Crown's word has to mean something across generations. Demonstrating financial transparency to a public increasingly willing to scrutinise royal finances, as this year's audit itself proves. And avoiding any appearance of singling out one branch of the family for special treatment, favourable or unfavourable. Respect the old lease, and critics call the arrangement excessive by modern standards. Challenge it without clear legal grounds, and William risks looking as though he is settling a family score rather than managing an institution. Edward's quiet, low-drama branch of the family has, without any dispute ever being filed, become a live test case for how the next reign will handle inherited royal contracts. The future king's real problem was never Edward's rank. It was the precedent sitting quietly inside the paperwork. Every royal conspiracy video eventually promises an offshore twist, so here is this story's version, and it deliberately refuses to give viewers what they expect. There is no secret Caribbean account here. No shell company routing money to a private royal trust. No hidden safe. If that is the story you came for, the documented record simply does not support it. And inventing one would not be reporting, it would be fiction dressed up as an investigation. Follow the real phrase instead: Crown Estate profits. It leads somewhere far less cinematic and far more consequential. The Crown Estate manages enormous stretches of Britain's seabed, including the rights to develop offshore wind farms across UK waters. For the financial year ending in March 2026, the Crown Estate reported a net operating profit of £1.245 billion, down 13% from the previous year, as one-off wind leasing option fees from an earlier auction round faded. Of that, £487 million was transferred to HM Treasury. None of that money is Edward's personal income. None of it is a private account belonging to Charles. The Crown Estate operates as an independent commercial business under Treasury sponsorship, and its profits fund the public purse first. The seabed side of that business keeps expanding. Offshore wind capacity within Crown Estate waters has grown to roughly 13 gigawatts, spread across 36 operational wind farms, and the organisation has already begun preparing a 6th leasing round for the years ahead. Parliament granted the Crown Estate new powers in 2025 to retain a larger share of its own revenue for reinvestment, specifically to fund further offshore wind development. None of that expansion has anything to do with which royal cousin occupies which Surrey mansion. From there, a separate statute takes over. The Sovereign Grant Act of 2011 established the funding mechanism that supports the monarchy's official duties, calculated as a set percentage of Crown Estate profits from 2 years earlier, currently 12%. Parliament sets that rate. Parliament can change it. The system was built, quite deliberately, for public accountability rather than family discretion. Here is the actual reframe this chapter delivers. Viewers followed a trail expecting a private fortune. That trail leads instead to public law, to a seabed full of wind turbines, and to a parliamentary formula that has nothing to do with which royal cousin lives in which Surrey mansion. The word crown makes all of this sound personal, intimate, almost domestic. The statutes underneath it say otherwise. They describe a public institution, audited, reported, and increasingly scrutinized in exactly the kind of government document that produced this investigation in the first place. The offshore trail never reached Edward's bank account. It led directly back to Parliament, and to a wind auction most viewers have never heard of. By now, the evidence wall is complete. and it is worth stepping back from the paperwork to look at what it actually cost the people living inside it. Edward received the title he had been publicly promised in 1999, but only for his own lifetime. James, Earl of Wessex, inherited his father's earldom, as expected, but not a guaranteed future dukedom. Bagshot Park remained Crown Estate property throughout, even as the family's residency there was secured under a lease, built to outlast several lifetimes, provided the right permissions are granted at the right moments. Slow down here, because the emotional register of this story is not triumph. It is something quieter. Edward spent decades building an identity around steady, largely unglamorous public service, often standing in contrast to louder, more scandal-prone branches of the family tree. Sophie became one of the household's most reliable working members, a role widely acknowledged by royal commentators well before this year's headlines. Lady Louise Windsor and James, Earl of Wessex, were raised deliberately outside the most intense royal spotlight, a choice their parents have discussed publicly on more than one occasion. Their branch of the family represents loyalty sustained across decades, without any corresponding guarantee of permanence. Resist the urge to cast Charles as a cartoon antagonist here, because the evidence never supports it. The real antagonist in this story is not a person, it is a habit. The institution's tendency to use warm, ceremonial language in public, while the practical limitations sit, unannounced, in separate legal documents that almost no one reads. That habit is not unique to Edward's branch of the family. It shows up throughout this year's National Audit Office report, across multiple leases, multiple generations, and multiple public statements that read more generously than the underlying paperwork actually supports. Edward's case simply happens to be the clearest illustration, because his story runs cleanly from a 1999 wedding to a 2026 government audit, with every step publicly documented along the way. Edward's apparent victory in 2023 was incomplete. Charles's apparent control over the outcome was also incomplete. He could shape the ceremony, but not unilaterally rewrite a lease signed under a previous reign. And William's future authority, whenever it arrives, will exist inside the same web of inherited laws and agreements, not above it. The chapter closes on the headline's single most misleading word, the one every version of this story eventually has to confront. The real verdict was never about inheritance in the sentimental sense. It was about the difference between a title someone gives you and a contract built to survive whoever is currently in charge of giving things away. Time for a verdict, count by count, the way this investigation always promised. Count 1. Edward inherited the Dukedom of Edinburgh from Prince Philip. Not technically true. Charles created a new, fourth instance of the title specifically for Edward in 2023, and Edward holds it only for his own lifetime, not as a direct hereditary transfer from his father. Count 2. Edward owns Bagshot Park. False. The Crown Estate remains the freeholder. Edward's company holds a 150-year lease, not a title of ownership. Count 3. Edward's family has no position beyond his own lifetime. Overstated. The Bagshot Park lease is long-term, and per this year's National Audit Office report, assignable with the Crown Estate's permission, which gives the family's residency a durability the dukedom itself does not share. Padding is not the same word as guaranteed, and this investigation will not pretend otherwise. Count 4. Edward's lawyers publicly defeated King Charles. Unsupported. No reliable public record documents any such confrontation, statement, or legal filing. That claim does not survive contact with the actual documents. Count 5. William has no reason to pay attention to any of this. Unconvincing. The Bagshot Park arrangement demonstrates in granular detail how decisions made during one reign can quietly constrain the options available to the next. The ending here is not explosive, and it is not supposed to be. Edward did not defeat his brother. Charles did not fully deny his father's wishes. He honored them in the narrowest form his own priorities allowed. William was not exposed as secretly maneuvering against his uncle. No document supports any of those dramatic versions of events, and a fair reading of the record has to say so plainly, even when the plain version is less exciting than the headline that brought you here. What actually connects 3 generations of this family is quieter than any of that. A promise made in 1999, a temporary title granted in 2023, and a 150-year contract signed in 2007 that none of the 3 men fully control on their own. Ceremony creates recognition, law creates protection, and in this family, as in most institutions built to outlast any single person holding power, the paperwork always ends up mattering more than the party. The Crown gave Edward a title that ends with him. The lease created something built to outlive the ceremony in time.